We're in this series on the vine. And it's about the fact that God is doing a new thing. I said this a few weeks ago, remember when we started. God is doing a new thing in Jesus. That's what we find at the start of John and actually all the way through John's Gospel. And we talked about how, I used the illustration of how in 1901 there was a cemetery in the middle of the city. But then the state government did a new thing there. And they built a railway station, Central Station. And God is doing similarly, but dissimilarly, because it's universal and cosmic. God is doing a new thing. It will take work and it will take time, but it started in Jesus. And I talked about how in John chapter 15, when you get quite a way through the Gospel of John, you have this image of the vine, a metaphor that Jesus uses. And what he's doing with that metaphor is explaining to us how he's going to engage you in his new work. He's doing a big thing. It's in Jesus. The vine metaphor tells you how it's going to engage with you. I am the true vine, he says. My Father is the gardener, and you are the branches. And then he explains. And Matt got us going last week, week 2, focusing in on that line, that God, the Father, is like a gardener. And gardeners have, I just felt the joy of gardening as Matt was talking. He did talk a lot about gardening, rightfully so. The joy of gardening, of hopefulness and purposefulness and kind of joy. And that's the stuff that God has for us, joy and hopefulness and purpose. And tonight we're going to turn to that phrase that Jesus says, he is the true vine. And apart from him, you can do nothing. I just want you to sit with that phrase, those phrases for a moment. He is the true vine. The one that you need is what he's saying. And then in verse 4, apart from me, you can't do anything. Strong words, really strong words. And you've got to work out what is the fruit that this gardener is looking for. It's a metaphor, but what is the fruit? It talks about fruit a lot. And Jesus is saying you won't be able to do it. You won't be able to do the fruit without me. What is the fruit? It's worth, before getting much further in this series, it's worth just looking what is the fruit that he's talking about. And because it's a metaphor, he doesn't say, I'm talking about this. He tells you a picture, gives you a picture. And so at first you're like, hey, what is it? Slow down, what is it? And there's a few ways to come at it and work out what it is. But I think maybe the clearest is, look what he says directly after the vine metaphor. So the vine metaphor is verses 1 through to 8. And the next slide, please. And the next one. Yep, just hold it there. The very next thing that Jesus says after the vine metaphor is he talks all about love. The fruit is love, because listen what he says directly after the vine metaphor. Verse 9. First of all, he talks about the context of love. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. He's talking about love. Then he says the ability for love. Verse 10. If you keep my commands, you'll remain in my love. Just as I have kept my Father's command and I remain in his love. There's a lot of reflection going on. What he and the Father do is what's going to happen in us. Then he talks about the outcome of love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. Then he comes to the command of love, verse 12. My command is this, love each other as I've loved you. And then he gives you this substantial picture of verse 13. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friend. The vine metaphor talks about bearing fruit, and I'm saying the fruit is love for your neighbor. That's what he talks about next. It also makes sense of the fact, you can put through one more, please. Sorry, go back and hold. What's next? It also makes sense that he says the greatest commandment. Someone asks, what's the greatest commandment? And he says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. This is the thing that God in Christ is growing in us. Love. Love. And did you hear that really confronting statement that I read just before? No branch can bear fruit by itself. I didn't read the whole thing. I'm going to read the whole thing. John chapter 15, verses 4 to 6. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit. He's saying you can't love unless you remain in me. I am the vine and you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. But apart from me, you can do nothing. Jesus is talking about love. And he says, apart from him, you can't do it. It's very strong words. And I want you to let those words sit with you. Now, of course, we know that, I have heaps of family and friends who are apart from Christ, and they do love. They genuinely love. So what does he mean? Well, beautifully over in Matthew's Gospel, he differentiates between some kinds of love. And it's going to make a lot more sense when you hear it differentiate. Okay, so over in Matthew chapter 5, verse 46, and yeah, thanks very much. He says of tax collectors. Okay, and you remember what's a tax collector? No, none of us ever in history have liked tax collectors. But then back then it was particularly bad because they were Jewish people who had sold out on their own nation and were now collecting tax from their own people for the Roman government who had occupied and crushed them. And we know that they, like from the story of Zacchaeus, for example, they were just extorting and taking more than they should. Okay, so these are people who are not very loving. And Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, if you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? So Jesus says, yeah, there's a kind of love that everybody has, regular love. Even tax collectors, the lowest kind of, the most unloving type of person who's sold out, even they have a type of love. So Jesus is not saying you can't you can have no love whatsoever. He's saying there's a kind of love that apart from him, you can't do it at all. Before we really get in tonight, I want you to let that sit. Jesus says to you, you are unable without him. You are unable to do the thing that he's trying to produce in you, that he wants from you. You are unable to do it without him. Like a branch detached from a vine, you're unable to do it without him. And so I want to just focus in on this idea that Jesus says he's the true vine, and that apart from him, because he's the true vine, we do nothing. Regular love that even tax collectors have loves those who love you back. Regular love loves the lovely. Regular love is on my terms. Regular love centers on me, really. But divine love, the thing that he wants to grow in each of you, is different. Divine love loves those who don't love you back. Divine love loves the unloved. Divine love is not on my terms. Divine love loves my enemy. And divine love is not about me. Do you remember Corrie ten Boom, Dutch woman who ended up in a concentration camp in World War II? And in the Alpha course that Emma and I have been after for a year now, it's just finishing tomorrow night. She tells a story at the start about forgiveness. And she said that a guard that she remembered from one of the concentration camps, who had walked past her when she was naked, and she just said, she just was kind of sick with anger, and when she saw him, she remembered it all over, she said. And he walked up to her and said at this, a rally or something years later, like I think in the 50s, and said, I was a concentration camp guard, and I've come to Christ. He's forgiven me. Will you forgive him? Will you forgive me too? And she says, and you feel it with me right now. She says, I could not. Regular love can't, and almost shouldn't, right, forgive that. And you and I can do some regular love. But what Jesus is talking about is divine love. He wants to work something in you that you can't do on your own. Divine love. So I want to talk just a little about how we don't love like God wants us to love. I know a bunch of you, most of you in the room, and you're all pretty nice. And what's more, people tell me that I'm pretty nice. They do. People say, you're such a warm person, like you're really nice. But I can tell you that you and I don't have divine love on our own. I am kind of warm and kind of nice. But I'll tell you what, that warmth and the niceness can finish pretty quickly if you encroach on my sense of safety. Or if I'm really tired, or even just a little bit tired, or if I feel small, you will find that I'm not very warm. Just yesterday, my fractured little toe was hurting. My wife's sick. She's okay, she's not in crisis, it's just kind of management, but she's not home. My dishwasher started beeping the error codes, and I pulled it out and thought I'd fix it because I shook it and it started going, and then it beeped again, and suddenly the dishes are piling up. My mum's here to help, which is great, but you know, when you're 30, whatever, and your mum's living with you, it's hard. Right? I had a deadline that I was moving towards, and my son would not eat his lunch. And I was at the end of myself, and I stopped being warm. And I walked over him, sitting at the steps, and I berated him in his face with hot blood. And there was just no love. There was no kind of ability. He's not going to learn from me in that moment. It's not a love. My love had stopped. I'd moved to something else. I've noticed as just working this week on Jesus is the true vine. He says there's stuff that I can't do. I'm trying to look this week at my love. I was just noticing how I do and don't love people just in the street. And as I looked on the street, I just keep noticing how I rate myself against almost every person I see on the street. How I at least rate them based on what they look like. It's just my love is pretty shallow actually. And I suspect that even though you're all pretty nice, the ones I've met, and I assume you haven't, our love is shallow. And I want to say that we either have a lack of love, like I've just described in a few different ways, just a complete lack of love there, or our loves are kind of intermingled so deeply with our own needs and desires. We might really be doing good to someone, loving someone, but it's so much for ourselves. I love to hear that Dan and Haley and Siobhan last week have become lifesavers, and that makes us about a crew of 10 from our little church here that are lifesavers. And part of the cultural story about lifesaving and what we say out loud, and it's right, is that lifesaving is about service and sacrifice. And it is. And I've never met a lifesaver who doesn't love being at the beach and doesn't love hanging out with other people and kind of getting a bit of authority and, you know, some responsibility, and here you can drive this thing. There's so much of me and what I love, but I really enjoy, wrapped up in the service and the sacrifice. I'm not having a go. I'm just saying it's interesting, isn't it? It's not pure service and sacrifice. It's all mixed up. I was at a barbecue yesterday for another citizenship person, a person who's become a citizenship, not Kevin, but another friend. And you know, that was the deadline I'd been moving towards. I had to pick something up and bring it at a certain time. And I had that morning that I just told you about, and I got there, and do you know what? I didn't feel like meeting new people at that point. And so what I did was, I served. I got on the barbecue, I chopped up beans, I did, and Annie, my friend, was so thankful. And she said, I saw her this morning, and she said, you were so helpful yesterday. Thanks so much. And I had to confess to her. I said, it wasn't for you, it was for me. I didn't feel like meeting any of your friends. And what I'm trying to explain to you is that, isn't it true that so much of our service is wrapped up with what I want? It's regular love. Now, I think it's okay to do what I did yesterday, but I'm saying it's not like, even the most loving person we see, there's often motivations that are equal. I was reading this week about a Austrian psychiatrist called Viktor Frankl. Some of you might have come across him in the past. He wrote a book that was very influential in the 20th century called Man's Search for Meaning. And he reflects on his time in a concentration camp. And one of the things that he reflects on is how people who had in society before the war been very upright and dignified citizens suddenly became very cruel and just let go of their morals and their ethics because they were in this terrible situation. And what his reflection was is he doesn't think the person changed. It was the situation that changed. It no longer suited them to be loving and to be upright and dignified. It suited them and looked after them to be something else. And so they were the same person who was still looking after themselves. They were just in a different situation now. And you can see why, right? Like your safety's on the line. And so if you give to other people and say no to things that you should say no to, that's dangerous. So It's showing up a human kind of love, a regular kind of love. We don't love like he's calling us to. We're not full of that fruit that he's looking for. And I want you to think about why. Why don't we do it? Because I want to think about in a minute how we can do it. Why are we so shallow and cool and quick to cool in our love? I think it's because of maths. Maths is something I don't like at all. So no, it's not that I'm blaming maths. I think it's a simple question of maths. Though I don't think we do consciously moment by moment, but subconsciously I think we're doing it. Which is, I know that if I give to other people, I will lose for myself. Because love, true, even kind of regular love, it always costs something. Love, and particularly divine love, will cost us power. You just have to give up power sometimes and not do what you could have. Love will cost us influence as we step back from moving things to giving. Love will cost us dignity. You lower yourself. It'll cost us rest. It'll cost us money. And it'll cost us comfort. And so I think we're all good mathematicians at this point. And we just get to a point where we feel like, I'm not going to have enough if I give beyond here. And so our love stops. The tax collector can love the person who loves them back, but not much more. Because they know that if they give more, they won't have any left. But Jesus is different. Jesus is the one, he's the true vine who does love in a divine way. In Isaiah chapter 5, the Old Testament, Matt showed it to us last week, we saw that the people of God were supposed to be the vine that bore fruit for God. But when he looked, all there was sour grapes. And what he says is injustice and bloodshed. And Jesus comes onto the scene and says, I am the true vine. And it's true, when you look at him, he does work and live and walk with divine love. Philippians chapter 2 says that Jesus, who had eternity by the Father's side, emptied himself and became human again, and then lowered himself further to a death on a cross. We see Jesus touching a leper at the start of Mark's Gospel, someone who had not been touched for years and years. But Jesus gives to someone who can't give from him, but can only take from him. And actually, you see, the leper who was supposed to, we talked about this earlier in the year, I think, the leper who has to stay outside the town is clean and comes inside because Jesus healed him with a touch. But it says at the end of the story that Jesus had to stay outside the town because people were swamping him now. Jesus gives, not for his own sake, but for the sake of the person in front of him. Jesus loves, not like making a barbecue, but for what is actually needed, not for him, but for others. Jesus comes to a town in Jericho, and who does he have lunch with? The most despicable in the town. He finds the most despicable in the town and he goes and has lunch. I have regular love, and so I invite people over that I enjoy their company. Jesus has lunch with Zacchaeus and changes his life and gives to him. And people are confused and they don't like Jesus even more now because he's having lunch with Zacchaeus. That's divine love. Jesus is always eating with the tax collectors and the sinners and the prostitutes. And he eats and drinks with those people so much that people start calling, he loses from that. People start calling him a drunk and a glutton because he's always spending time with those people. What kind of guy is that hangs out with them? Jesus loves for the sake of others, and it always costs him. He loves with divine love. And then at the crucifixion, Jesus is cut off from the Father. For your sake. Because we ought to be cut off. Because we don't love properly. We love for our own sake all the time. But he loves you and doesn't want you to be cut off. So he was cut off for us at the cross. Jesus has deep, you-centered love, other person-centered love. And I want you to see tonight, through mission one, get out there. I want you to see, first of all, that Jesus, in those ways I've just mentioned, is an example of divine love. But he's not just an example of divine love. Greater love has no person than this, that they lay down their life for their friends. And that's what he's done for you. It's a great example. He actually did that one. But secondly, what you see at the cross and the resurrection of Jesus is forgiveness for our lack of love. He paid. He was cut off so that we will not be cut off. He paid our debt of sin. But thirdly, he is the true vine, and he actually gives you power for you to start loving with divine love. Now, we probably won't get fruit in the next 6 weeks, and I probably won't change very much in the next 6 weeks. But if we do the right things that a good gardener would do, see what I do. But if we do the right things, and the kinds of things that God the Father, who is a gardener, does, there will be fruit. And there's power in the cross and the resurrection for growth in you. Let me tell you how. When I'm berating my son with no love, it's about a lack of control. I felt out of control by lunchtime yesterday, and I wanted to get control. At the cross and resurrection of Jesus, I don't only see an example. An example would have helped me in that moment yesterday. I don't only get forgiveness, that would help a little bit, and it did later in the day. But I also get power because at the resurrection of Jesus, even though things looked out of control, he was cut off. At the resurrection of Jesus, I see that this one has true control. When everything's out of control, so out of control that Jesus, the Son of God, has been crucified, he's nonetheless resurrected. And if I will abide in the truth of his resurrection, I can have a sense of, not my control, but that there is control and there is security and it's not all falling apart, even when it looks like it's falling apart. Now, I can't just kind of suddenly think of it. I've got to abide in that, sit in that, and remain in that. And it's got to remain in me. And if it does, then maybe after 6 weeks or 6 months, the truth of the resurrection and the control he has that is shown and exhibited at the resurrection will start growing into the fruit of love. The maths that I do, of subconsciously, I think, of not feeling safe, not feeling secure in the day, I will feel a little more secure if I've got the resurrection abiding with me and seeing it. What about how I judge people on the street and kind of just puff myself up in a room and just check out who's, life's there at the club, who's got the most qualifications, where do I fit in here? There's a lack of love going on there. But at the cross, Jesus laid down his life for me. I have all the dignity in the world if I'll abide at the cross. That I belong to him. And it doesn't matter if someone's above me or below me in this room, because I belong to the Father. He laid down his life. I'm okay. I'm accepted. And that will take my eyes off me and where I fit here, because I fit here with God. And that will give me just a bit more in the maths to give away in love. And I can dignify other people because it's not costing me or it's not taking away from me. I've got all the dignity in the world because of the cross. So I want you to see how the cross of Jesus, the life and cross and the resurrection of Jesus, is not just an example of love. It is. And it's not just forgiveness for our lack of love. It is. It's also power for sanctification, power for growth of love, so that we can give ourselves up moment by moment. And so I want to encourage you to go out, not even go out, I want you to go into nibbles in a few minutes' time with love and just moment by moment, consider others as better than yourself. And look to the needs of the people around us. And go to the person who doesn't have something to give to you, but you have something to give to them. And then go out and do that in your week. He's growing fruit in us. And as we hear the stats that Matt Smith just talked about, there's so much pain in the world, darkness in the world. And one of my fears preparing this sermon this week has been, I just go and love someone. It feels low level, doesn't it? It feels simple, it feels cliche. And it kind of is simple. But I do believe that God has so much good for us to do if we'll do this divine kind of work. So many dark places to go and be a light. So many people who are sitting in darkness to go and share with and lift, just even for a few minutes maybe. I want to talk about what loving like this does not mean. Loving like this, divine love, empowered by the true vine, doesn't mean that you never rest. Because he is the vine. And it's all about resting in him, actually. And he commands you, and he's going to talk about it in the metaphor all sorts of commands that he has for you. And one of them is that you rest sometimes. Rest in him most of all, but also that we take time to look after ourselves. So it doesn't mean that we kind of just wear ourselves out until there's nothing left. That wouldn't be wise. This also doesn't mean that you need to quit your job and become a missionary or work for a charity, although it might. I hope, it hasn't happened yet in our 5 years, but I hope in the next year or two, someone will quit their job because they realize actually they've got the kind of spiritual gifts and shape of life and ability to quit and go on mission somewhere else away from us, or to go and work at a charity. Okay, but that's not necessarily what this means, because God wants to bear fruit in all places in our world. It's all of the world is his world, not just kind of over there on mission or in church land or in charity land. But in your industry, he wants to see fruit born, the fruit of loving other people. So don't look too big. You might look big, but look where he has you. This also doesn't mean that you should have low self-esteem. C.S. Lewis has a great line, many great lines. One of them is, humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. You might have the most qualifications in the room. You might have the most skill or whatever in the room. The point of loving other people is not to pretend that you don't. It's to think of yourself a little less and think of the people around and how you can bless them and how you can use whatever God's given you to bless other people. It doesn't mean low self-esteem. This also doesn't mean that I or you are better than our non-believing neighbours. We all start at different places depending on our genetics and our family and stuff. And what this is saying is that God can grow divine fruit in you, divine love in you, which is fruit. That would be more than what you would have had without him. A lot more than what you would have had. You don't need to, again, it's part of the cross says, you're mine and I love you. And therefore you don't need to compare to other people. And you mustn't compare to other people either. Corrie ten Boom said, I couldn't forgive him. And then she goes on to say, I needed God to forgive through me. So she prayed. And she was able to forgive the guard from raven. And I'm not asking you to use math illustration from last week. I'm not asking you to be a crystal that adds another crystal on the side and works harder now and focuses on loving people. That's not what I'm asking you to add on to yourself. I'm inviting you or telling you to look to Jesus, who says, abide in me. He does command you to love him. But he says 11 times through there, remain in me and you'll bear much fruit. Don't go out and try really hard. Do what Corrie ten Boom did and stop and see your limits. And even in that moment of seeing your limits, in that moment abide and say, God, I'm so limited. I feel my limits right now. That's abiding. We're gonna talk about abiding in 2 weeks, I think. But what I'm saying is the focus to go out with tonight is not, I better go love some people because I want to be a good Christian. No, the focus is, I better abide in Christ because apart from him, I can do nothing. And with him, who's given himself to me at the cross, I can do things to bear fruit.
Why don't we just stand?